All right, guys, let's talk about prison and the rise of prisons, what we call the prison boom in America. Look at these incarceration trends between 1980, let me get my little drawing stick out right here, through 2006. And in fact, if we were to extend this out to 2012, it would kind of keep going. Then in 2012, it kind of levels off and starts to go back down again. So what we've seen here in 1980, when I was in high school, none of you were born, um, we saw the incarceration rate was about 125 per 100,000 people. By 2006, it had grown to 500 per 2,000 people. That's about a 300% increase in the number of people we're putting in prison. So let's take a look at another chart, though. This pink line here, which we will use some little blue to go over, this is the violent crime rate. As we see, the violent crime rate goes down about 1999, 2000. At the same time, the incarceration rate was going up. And about this time here, the late 90s, early 2000s, we hit sort of an equilibrium point where crime and incarceration, kind of level off and level off this way. And you see there, since then, we've been on a sort of a flat trajectory. Clearly, there seems to be some correlation between the two. So, incarceration, the rise of incarceration to some extent may have brought down the violent crime rate, but let's look at some other factors. Let's just take a look at the numbers here. And in 1970, we had 300,000 people in jail or prison in this country. That includes federal, state, county lockup. By 2016, we had 2.3 million people in these same jails or in these same systems, not the actual jails. That's a 7.5 or like a 650% increase in the number of people we're locking up. Currently today, there are 7.3 million people either in prison, on parole, or on probation. So we are a law and order lock 'em up country. Crime rate over the last 10 to 15 years, though, has remained relatively stable, really since 1999. So since really about the last 19 years, the crime rate hasn't changed a whole lot. We're starting to see it tick back up a little bit the last couple of years. Remember those charts we saw at the beginning of the semester. But since the early 2000s, the crime rate has been relatively stable, but we're still putting more people in prison. What explains this increase over the last 30, 40, 50 years? Well, two trends. One is the war on drugs, and the second is the rise of private prisons. Let's start with the first, the war on drugs. A little social policy timeline here. In the 1960s, street crime became a very profitable policy issue for politicians, in particular one Richard Milhous Nixon, President of the United States from 1968 to 1974. Excuse me. In 1970, Nixon waged war on drugs and crime. Okay. 1973, the federal government established the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the DEA, as it's known by its acronym. The 1970s saw a rapid increase of cocaine from South America. Cocaine became a very fashionable drug among the upper classes, but it really wasn't all that profitable. I mean, it was profitable in individual sales, but as an overall industry, it was generating money, but there was a lot of costs involved. So if you got caught smuggling cocaine, you had you lost all of your product. So they needed something a little more profitable. So in the 1980s, federal policy not shifted, but we saw the rollout of something called the Just Say No movement. Just Say No to Drugs. That was Nancy Reagan's campaigns. It was her cause celeb as a first lady. was to take on drug abuse in the United States. And she enlisted one of my heroes. Oh, come on, where are you? There you are, Mr. T, Pity the Fool. This is a picture, iconic picture of Mr. T and Nancy Reagan, First Lady Nancy Reagan, that's at the White House. That's the White House Christmas tree in the background. She's giving Mr. T a little kiss on the head. She's also holding here in her hand a Mr. T doll, which is a valued Christmas present in the mid-1980s. And he was part of her War on Drugs team. He helped push the Just Say No message across the nation. So let's go back to the timeline. I mentioned that cocaine was a great drug for drug dealers, but it wasn't as profitable as it could be because only people who could really afford cocaine were rich people. And so they started creating, dealers and manufacturers started creating and distributing a cheap derivative of cocaine, which we call crack. And crack is not expensive like cocaine is. The high you get from crack is evidently more intense and does things to your body in ways that cocaine never imagined it could do. In the 1980s, we had what was called a crack moral panic. Kind of what some people say we're going through that right now with the coronavirus. But during this time period, for example, here you go, Crack and Crime in Newsweek, the cover of Newsweek. Okay. So in 1986, 1988, anti-drug abuse acts were passed, and for the first time, why this is important for prisons is we enforced minimum and mandatory sentencing guidelines. So if you're caught with drugs, judges they lose all of their discretion to say, well, it's a first offense, we'll let him off. No, under mandatory guidelines, what that means is that you have to serve a minimal amount of time in jail, which is why people who were picked up for drug offenses in the 80s and 90s spent time in jail. And it's one reason why the prison population grew so much. In 1990, George Bush, the first president, proposed massive spending on the drug war. He really took on the cartels. At the time, they weren't quite the cartels. It took on the Colombia, Medellin cocaine distributors. They spent a lot of money trying to keep drugs from coming in to our shorelines. As I mentioned earlier in a previous module, most cocaine is brought into this country over water. In the 80s, people were flying it in by plane and in dropping it in the United States at airstrips. There was a good movie. It's called Blow. Johnny Depp's in it. It's a story about a guy who made a bunch of money doing this during the 1970s and 80s. There's another movie about Tom Cruise. Both are based on true stories about a drug smuggler who was flying it in to Louisiana and doing some crazy, dropping it out. He cut a hole in the bottom of the plane and he would just drop it out as he flew over the bayous, and then he had people on the ground picking it up. It's a pretty cool movie. Any event. So every now and then people would look at this policy and go, is this war on drug? We're criminalizing all drug activity. Can we not look at drug use as a medical issue as opposed to a, sorry, my phone, it's going crazy, as opposed to a criminal issue? But that's not a real popular way to get yourself reelected, by saying, well, drugs really aren't a crime, because everybody says, well, we got to get tough on drugs, we got to get tough on crime. And so we had this war on drugs. And that was the result. So what are some of the policy results that came out of all this? 3 strike laws, 0 tolerance laws, truth in sentencing guidelines, and highly effective monitoring techniques. So a 3 strike law is, on your 3rd felony conviction, you're in jail for life. And California passed 3 strike laws, and California jails are busting at the seams because they have all these people locked up and they can't let them go because they were brought in under this 3 strike law. So what we saw is a massive increase in imprisonment for drug-related charges. Lower threshold for prison. In other words, if you had enough on you, enough marijuana on you that they thought you were going to distribute, then you could go to jail for 5 to 10 years minimum, depending upon whether or not it was your first offense. All right. Now, despite the fact that we're putting more people in jail, when you did a survey of people about their attitudes about dealing with crime, everybody says we're not doing enough. This line up here at the top, this percentage of people who says we aren't tough enough on crime. And these down here on the bottom are the people who say we're either just about right, or these guys say we're too tough on crime. So it's really interesting that even though we are locking up more people throughout the 1980s and 1990s, people still thought we weren't doing enough. So we really had become a culture that really wanted to get tough on crime. And we were locking up more people at a faster rate than any other industrialized country in the Western world. Who is most affected by this? Affected, not effected. Low education people, racial and ethnic minorities. If you look at prison admissions by race, you see in the 80s, everybody was kind of even here. These are whites, blacks, others. But starting in about the mid to late 80s, black incarceration rates skyrocketed compared to white and Hispanic and other incarceration rates. Whites and Hispanics stayed relatively the same. Now you see a little bit of gap growing here in the late 90s, early 2000s. But what we saw mainly is this huge gap between blacks and everyone else. So there was really a why? Why all of a sudden this big change in the late 80s? Well, war on drugs. We started targeting neighborhoods where basically black neighborhoods for arrest, because that's where the drug trade was happening. At least that's what the police alleged. So they started going into certain neighborhoods and locking up people with men, and with the new sentencing guidelines requiring you to spend a minimum amount of time in jail, these folks were going to prison for quite a while. All right, so some fun with numbers. So I've showed you this number already, but if we look at prison population by race, we see that whites, blacks, and Hispanics, about 40% of the population in prison is black, 33% white, 20% Hispanic. Look over here at these incarceration rates. In federal prison, the same kind of thing shows here. Let's remember, there's a difference between state and federal crimes. A state crime, you go to a state prison. So if you commit murder within the state of Texas, that's a state crime. If you commit a robbery within the state of Texas, that's a state crime. However, if you kidnap somebody, if you rob a bank, or if you commit a crime across state lines, so like you were involved, you drove to Louisiana and robbed a casino and came back, that's a federal crime because you went across state lines. Let's just say it's a federal crime. There are extenuating circumstances. But one thing I want you to look at real quick is if we look at gender by prison population. What we find here, 93% of people in the prisons are men, not women. So all these lectures about prison are really about men. If you look at the population by race, 63% of our population is non-Hispanic white, and they make up 25% of the population in prison. This means that the odds of a white person going to prison are about 61% lower than the odds of a non-white person going to prison. If you look at Hispanics for the 2017 data, about 10% of the population, give or take. About a third of federal prisons, again, these are not state prisons, these are federal prisons. So if you are a Hispanic, the odds of going to prison are 3.7 times greater than a non-Hispanic. African Americans make up 12% of the general population and about 38% of people in federal prison. So the odds of an African American going to prison are about 3 to 1 compared to a non-African American. All right, so what's the lesson here? Hispanics, African Americans are way overrepresented in prison, whereas whites are underrepresented in prison. So the prison boom we've seen over the last 20, 30 years has disproportionately affected these two ethnic groups and frankly, African Americans have taken if you combine state and federal prison data together, you will see African Americans have taken the real brunt. They've suffered the most under the war on drugs. Let's take a look at this cohort. This is interesting. So a cohort of people are the same people born in the same, everybody born within a certain time frame. So the cohort between 1965 and 1969, and this is oh y'all, I'm so bad at this. Look, I'm 3 years old doing this. This is Gen X. People born between 1945 and 64 are baby boomers. I'm a baby boomer. So people born from 65 to 69 are Gen X. My wife is a Gen Xer. If you were born during this time frame and you were, for example, of all the people born between this time frame, 3% of the white men and 20% of the black men who were Gen Xers saw some prison time in their lifetime. If you look at it by education, you see a third of the African Americans who didn't graduate from college are going to wind up going to see some prison time. And 60% of African American men, again, these are men, who didn't graduate from high school, who were born during this time frame, were going to spend some time in their life in prison. Look at these other numbers. The real interesting thing is if you had been born between 1945, 45 and 49. Come on. Okay. If you'd have been black male born during this time frame, you are much less likely of going to prison than a black male born during this time frame. So I would have to say that as a society, we were less racist in the 70s than we were in the 40s and 50s, back when segregation was the law of the land. But if you were a black man born during this time frame, during the early 5 years of the baby boom, versus Gen X, the Gen X black guys have a 2.5 times odds of going to prison compared to the baby boom black guys. Okay? This goes to show you how the war on drugs and our 3 strikes laws, etc., have really affected people in the prison and disproportionately affected black men going to prison. All right, some other numbers. So in 1980, 14% of black male dropouts were in prison. By 1999, 41% of black male dropouts, high school dropouts, were in prison. Since the year 2000, at any given time, over 10% of all black males between the age 20 or 30 were incarcerated either in federal, state, or county, local jails. Despite the fact that whites and blacks use drugs at roughly the same rate, blacks are 10 times more likely to be brought up on drug charges than whites are. They're 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than whites are. One of the reasons why is police attention to black neighborhoods. In other words, the neighborhoods in which blacks live have been selectively targeted compared to the neighborhoods where whites live. And that's why, despite the fact that whites and blacks use drugs at the same rate, particularly marijuana at the same rate, black guys are more likely to go to prison and get arrested for it, go to prison, because the police are more likely to go to their neighborhoods than to the white neighborhoods when it's time to, round up the usual suspects, as they said in Casablanca. All right, prison and the life course. What's interesting is that for some segments of society, just at some point in your life, there's just this expectation, yeah, I may wind up going to prison for a short period of time. It's just become normalized. Oh, yeah, well, he's in prison right now, but he'll be out in a few years. Going to prison disrupts your life in many ways. In addition to being away from your family, it means you're less likely at some point to have a job, less likely to have a stable job that that has a pay raise ladder, that sort of thing. You're less likely to be married or cohabitate with the parent of your children, and you're less likely to have non-criminal children. Recidivism in the United States, what is recidivism? That is repeat offenders. So out of every 5 people who get out of prison, 3 will commit another crime, get caught, and wind up back in prison. Okay? So out of every 5 people who leave prison, 3 of them will be back in prison, usually within 3 years. All right, so I'm going to skip through the rest of these slides here. Come down here, let's look at age in prison. Because we have so many people locked up in prison right now, currently about 25% of people in prison are there for drug arrest. By 2030, and in the next 10 years, 1/3 of all people in prison will be over the age of 55. Frankly, no longer a threat to society. At 55, going on 56, I have no energy to go out and commit crimes. And the recidivism rates for adults over 65 is only 4%. So 4 out of 100, as opposed to 60% for young people who are let out of prison. It's only 4%. So one of the things our prisons are suffering with is an older population, an aging population, and aging populations have special needs, they have medical needs, and they're just being warehoused in these places for basically no other reason than, many of them were stuck there under third strike or under mandatory sentencing guidelines. The criminal justice system is the second fastest growing category of state budget, so we are spending more on prisons now. Half of the prisoners in federal prison are there for drug offenses, compared to 25% in state prisons. It costs the same amount to keep somebody in a California prison for a year. It costs about $67,000. Okay, $67K to house a California prisoner for 1 year. That's a CA for California. Give you some perspective. That's the same tuition as it costs to send a student to this school you may have heard of, Harvard. I can't write Harvard in this. For a year, okay? So we are spending the same amount of money to keep somebody warehoused in a prison in California as it would cost to send a student to Harvard, about $67,000 a year. Just to give you some idea of what we're spending money on. Private prison. Private prison. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened. Right now, about 8% of all prisoners are incarcerated in a private prison. Private prisons are private for-profit entities. In other words, they make money. Because they are private prisons, they have 2 incentives. One is to keep people in the prison beds, because each person in there is money or profit to the company. The second incentive they have, because they need to make money, is to cut cost. So private prisons, they have their own ability. The warden of that prison, their supervisor, has their own ability to essentially punish inmates. So what they can do is they can write them up on charges, within prison charges, that extends their time in prison. So one of the reasons why it's been hard to get people out of private prisons is because there's a strong disincentive to parole people from private prisons, i.e. they lose money. They also cut costs, so it also makes these prisons slightly more dangerous than public prisons, because one of the ways they cut costs is to have fewer security guards working, which means, when there's fewer guards around, there's more incentive more opportunity for the prisoners to do awful things to each other. All right. Right now we have Texas is the largest private prison state with 12,700 people in private prison. Between 2006 and 2012, the nation saw a 39% increase in prisoners that are put in private prisons. Probably the largest company is something called Geo Group. And we used to have one of their prisons in Waco. In fact, it closed, I think, last year. It's out on the road as you're heading toward the Brick, kind of that area. You saw the barbed wire and the big silver building. That was a private prison. So prison rates are up because the war on drugs and to a lesser extent privatization of prisons. It's just an incentive to keep people in prison longer. The prison system is highly skewed toward African American men. Again, at one point I said that 10% of all African American men or 20%, I believe, were in prison at one point. 10% were in prison sometime during the year in the 2000s. It's a cause of what we call structural inequality in the United States. All right, that's it for this lesson. Thank you very much.